6 weeks. Just think about that for a second. In 1916, that was the average life expectancy for a junior officer on the front line of the First World War. It's a pretty shocking number, and it's the brutal reality that is right at the heart of one of the most powerful plays ever written about war.
So today, we're going to pull back the curtain on R.C. Sherriff's masterpiece, Journey's End. We're going to dive into the raw historical truth of the trenches, the world that Sherriff himself actually lived through, and the world he so bravely put on stage for everyone to see.
All right, so here's how we're going to break it all down. First, we'll look at the myth of glory that got so many men to sign up. Then we'll get into the whole psychological pressure of the stiff upper lip. We'll face the grim reality of the trenches, see how soldiers managed to survive, and finally look at how Sherriff turned all of this into pure theatrical truth.
Okay, so let's start with that first one, the myth of glory. See, before all the mud and the madness, there was this idea, an idea of what war was supposed to be. And, well, it was an idea that turned out to be tragically, dangerously wrong.
In the early days of the war, society was just gripped by this patriotic fever. I mean, the message was everywhere you looked. Signing up is your duty. It's a grand adventure. It's your chance to be a hero. And this wasn't just a friendly suggestion. It was immense cultural pressure.
And just look at this. Symbols like the military cross, which was awarded for bravery, they weren't just medals. Oh no, they were the ultimate badge of honor. For any young man back home, seeing one of these would have been totally awe-inspiring. It was a real, tangible symbol of the hero he thought he could become. And here's the kicker. The playwright, R.C. Sherriff, he was actually awarded this very medal.
Okay, so that's the myth. But what happened when those men actually got to the front? Well, that's where everything changed. That whole idea of glory just crumbled, and it was replaced by this rigid, unspoken rule, the stiff upper lip. This was all about the pressure to just hide your fear.
So what does that really mean, the stiff upper lip? Well, it was basically this expectation that you had to bottle everything up. Fear, anxiety, sadness, you couldn't show any of it. If you did, you risked being seen as weak, as a coward, not just by the guys next to you, but by everyone. That's an incredibly isolating burden to have to carry.
And you know, this pressure wasn't just on the battlefield. Soldiers were always thinking about home, but they were also terrified of what the folks back home would think of them. They lived with this constant fear that if their families ever found out the true mental and physical toll of the war, their reputations would be completely shattered.
Which brings us to the biggest contrast of all. We've talked about the myth and the psychological pressure. Now, let's look at the physical reality of the trenches. This is what life on the front line was actually like.
I mean, just look at this. It's night and day, right? On one side, you have the idea of war they sold to the public, a noble quest for bravery and honor. And on the other side, the brutal reality for the soldier. Constant, gnawing fear, rampant disease, and the terrifying power of modern weapons. The gap between those two worlds was just immense.
And the horrors were relentless. Soldiers had to endure extreme weather, which led to fatal conditions like hypothermia. Disease was everywhere. Trench foot, from standing in freezing, filthy mud all day, could mean getting your foot amputated. And hanging over all of it was the constant threat of artillery shells and machine guns, creating casualties on a scale that humanity had never, ever seen before.
But the wounds weren't just physical. The nonstop terror gave rise to a condition they called shell shock, which today we understand as post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. It was the mind's response to experiencing the unimaginable, a deep psychological injury caused by the horrors of war.
So, faced with this absolute nightmare, how did anyone possibly get through it? Well, that brings us to our next section, survival and solidarity. This is the story of how soldiers found ways to cope.
You see, survival wasn't just about luck. It was an active process. We can kind of think of it as a three-step path. First, soldiers had to find their own personal ways to deal with it all. Second, they built these incredibly powerful bonds with each other. And third, they had to rely on good, trusted leadership. And crucially, these coping mechanisms were often just simple human things. They'd have a drink to numb the fear. They'd talk endlessly about home, about sports, anything to feel a little bit normal. They found comfort in the simple routine of a meal. And maybe most importantly, they confided in one another, privately breaking that awful, isolating rule of the stiff upper lip. This camaraderie wasn't just about friendship. It was a survival tool. In a life-or-death situation like the trenches, you absolutely had to be able to depend on, respect, and trust the guys next to you.
Your life was literally in their hands, and theirs was in yours. And leadership was the glue that held it all together. A successful company needed a captain the men could look up to and trust. In fact, R.C. Sheriff himself served with an older officer that the men called Father because of his paternal presence. And that relationship is absolutely central to the characters of Stanhope and Osborne in the play.
And that brings us to our final section, where all of this history collides with art. This is Sheriff's Truth on stage, and it explains exactly why Journey's End was and still is such a game changer.
Just look at this timeline. The play premiered in 1928, a full decade after the war ended. For the audience, this experience was still fresh. The losses were still deeply felt. This wasn't some ancient history lesson. This was their lives. They had lived through the patriotic fever, the draft, and the painful silence that came after. Sheriff presented this world using a style called realism. And this was revolutionary because it deliberately rejected all those old myths. You won't find any grand heroes or glorified battles in Journey's End. Instead, what he shows us are ordinary, flawed men dealing with fear, boredom, and just the mundane, everyday moments of life in a dugout. And right here is the source of its power. This play is authentic. R.C. Sheriff wasn't some outsider looking in. He was an officer who had served on the front line. He had felt the fear, he relied on that camaraderie, and he witnessed the horrors with his own two eyes. The play is a piece of his own life, a testimony to what he and millions of others went through.
So we'll end with this. In 1928, Sheriff held up a mirror to a society that was recovering from trauma, and he showed them the unvarnished truth they needed to see. And it makes you wonder, doesn't it? Almost a century later, what are the uncomfortable truths that we need our artists, our writers, and our filmmakers to be showing us today?